to ancientherbal.care.com for all your skincare needs. That's ancientherbal.care.com. Link is at the top line of the description.
I take a lot of pride in this radio show. I'm building up listeners all around the Boston area. People were dying to hear rap music anywhere. You couldn't find it, on the radio and nowhere. So I was trying to sell ads, like I was talking about, to make some money. And I'm going around to local record stores and clothing stores, stuff like that in Boston. And they're laughing at me like, who's listening to a hip hop show on Harvard station? Like, they play classical music. Get out of here. So I'm like, I know I have all these listeners because my phones are ringing every week. And, I'm talking to people all over, throughout the city. And I'm like, damn, I got to figure out a way to show, that I have this audience to get the ads. So the first thing I did was say, I'm going to start a mailing list, and I would go on the radio every week, join the name of the radio show was Street Beat. And I would say, join the Street Beat mailing list, call in now. And I would stay up the whole show, writing down every name and address I could. And I set up some sign up boxes in local record stores around town with a little slip, hey, join the Street Beat mailing list, fill this paper out and drop it in the box. And so I built up a mailing list, like 1,000 names and addresses of people who listen to my radio show all around Boston. And it was around that time, which is, summer of 88, spring of 88. I'm finishing my sophomore year. I'm 19 years old when I start The Source. I think of, creating a newsletter and mailing out this newsletter to this mailing list I had built. And in answering the phones and all that time, I'm talking to hip hop fans every week, and they all want to know information. They're like, what's going on with this, and when is that, when's that new EPMD single coming, and who produced it, and who's featured on the new Big Daddy Kane album, whatever questions people wanted to know. And I'm sitting there like, wow, there's no information. Meanwhile, in addition to building up the distribution of The Source, I'm focusing on, through my radio show, building relationships with all the independent hip hop labels at the time. So the Tommy Boys, the Jive Records, the Profile Records, the Sleeping Bag Records, all these labels that were really, the main labels putting out hip hop in the 80s. I was starting to build relationships with their representatives so that they would send me their new music. I could have this new, the new Audio 2 single first before anyone else played it on the radio. Stuff like that was big back then. So I would learn information about what was going on from talking to all the label reps. And that was, again, where the idea, let me take this information and share it in the form of a newsletter to my audience. And I sent it out to all the record companies that I had contacts with. And, people loved it. It was free. The first few issues. The next one was 6 pages. The next one was 16 pages. And I'm like, well, I'm going to start selling this for $1.25. It was like a little 16-page black and white booklet. But, I put it out in the stores, started buying these little typing stands, metal typing stands that you would use to hold papers when you're typing. And that was so the record stores could display the magazines on their counter, because they didn't sell magazines. They had nowhere to display them. So that was all part of just getting the distribution out. I started basically tracking down mom and pop record stores in every city around the country, just however I could find out about them, calling people I knew in those markets, getting yellow pages, whatever it was. And just, before, a few years in, before I even graduated Harvard, we're in over 1,000 mom and pop record stores all over the country.
Wow.
And, that's where most people would go to find out, anything. You go to your local record store back in the day and just check in once a week or so to see what's going on. But people were loving The Source. So, yeah, I mean, I think after it got going a little bit, somebody turned me on to a book about the history of Rolling Stone magazine. I didn't know anything about Rolling Stone. I really didn't know about rock and roll music and who Jan Wenner was, but I read this book and it was very inspiring. I saw a lot of parallels between rock and roll and hip hop. Rock and roll in the 60s and 70s was, viewed by the mainstream as this, terrible music that's ruining the youth of America and it's
Mhm.
promoting drugs and all this kind of stuff like that. And it's very, very countercultural. And it was more than music. It was about, social, issues and politics and things like that. And I'm looking at it, I'm like, well, hip hop is going to be bigger than rock and roll because the difference between rock and hip hop was, although they're both music and art forms that were originally created by African Americans, as you guys know, with rock, that ended pretty fast. Thousands of people today that don't even know that Black people, created rock music because of Elvis and the Beatles and things like that were used to kind of, change the whole market of rock music. But that hadn't happened with hip hop. The biggest artists, the Run DMCs were selling 10 million records in the 80s. And, white kids, everybody were buying the music of Black artists. So in that sense, what I talked about before, hip hop being so powerful to unify and draw people together, that's really what I saw and was my driving force. So I'm going to build the Rolling Stone of the hip hop generation. And that's really, what I set out to do the next few years before the vision grew in the early 90s to, I'm building the Time Warner of the hip hop generation because
Right.
I began to see, the Source as a brand and began to understand that, I needed to get into other brand extensions, creating the Source Awards and getting into
Mhm.
television and doing things, things like that. And, Time Warner in those days was like this huge company that owned, magazines,
Yeah.
TV shows, networks, movies, all kinds of stuff. And that was like what I'm going to try to do, with the Source is become that for hip hop. So, yeah, man. And, there's a lot more I could keep going, if you guys have more questions, but
Yeah.
that covers the first, 10, 15 years of
No, that's
knowledge.
great.
In a nutshell.
Yeah, it's all content. It's great. We appreciate it.
Yeah,
And
man.
I'll talk about, after, you got the business going, you set up the Source magazine, the decision to bring Benzino and make him a partner. Talk about that.
Yeah, well, that happened some years later in 95, 96 is when I brought Benzino in as a partner. He and I, of course, had known each other for years before that. We met, while I was doing my radio show in Boston. I remember reading somewhere that this group had won the Boston Music Award for Best Rap Group, and I tracked them down, and that was his group. So, we became friends, and, we stayed friends over the years. And then around that time in the mid 90s, I think he was ready to move out of Boston and come down to the New York area. And, some things had happened on my end where, a couple of my original partners had left. And, that was the point where I was like, man, come on in and help me be a part of this thing. And that's kind of how that started.
Don't know. We had him on the show about a month or so ago, and I asked him about the whole situation with the East Coast West Coast beef. Obviously at that time there was no internet, there was no way of receiving information via the telephone. It was all pretty much disseminated through the magazine, and you guys covered that pretty extensively. In fact, a couple people throughout time put responsibility on some of y'all shoulders when it came to the deaths of that. Talk about the difficulty during that time, what you guys were going through as a magazine publication during the East Coast West Coast beef. How you felt after both of their various deaths, both legends' various deaths, and the criticism that the Source received for people saying that you guys deserve responsibility and what happened.
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't that difficult of a time for us. I mean, we were uh, still doing business as usual. I mean, we didn't do a Source Awards in '96 because of what was going on. So I could say it impacted that. But the magazine was business kind of as usual. As far as, those kind of rumors about the Source or whatever, that's something that is just not true. I mean, the source was extremely responsible in how,
Mhm.
and we tried to handle things versus some of the other publications. There's a great documentary that just came out on Vice TV a few weeks ago called Dark Side of the 90s. If you guys haven't checked out episode 8, they really go in depth into this and the story. Vibe magazine was the magazine, to be
Yeah.
honest, that was really the one that was
Mhm.
a lot of sensationalizing and irresponsible type of journalism that was, arguably inflamed things.
Hmm.
For example, what I did, I put, and this is, summer of '96, I put Suge Knight on the cover, and I made a point to put his in quotes from him, this ain't no East West thing. I wanted people to see that message on the front cover, like that's not what this is, and to try to, help ease some of the tensions through things like that. So I had always been, that's really what made the source the Bible of hip hop versus all these other magazines. They all contributed and had some quality things that they did, whether it was Vibe or, eventually XXL comes along and Rap Pages and all these other magazines. But the source really, we became the Bible because of our authenticity and my recognition of things like that. Like uh, I had some problems in the years prior with editors getting into it with artists and things getting kind of personal. And I didn't condone that stuff. It was like we're not the National Enquirer. Yeah, you can print kind of whatever you want, but you have a choice as a journalist and as a media, outlet as to, what kind of, journalism you're going to do. So I always took that responsibility really seriously. And I don't, I've never heard a credible, presentation of how the source ever contributed to hyping things up or anything like that. So I would just, disagree with that part of it.
Right.
Yeah, that was definitely more they criticized Vibe at that time. But let's talk about some of like the unsigned hype. You guys were responsible for discovering and even helping further the career of people like DMX, Common, Biggie. Talk about that, and a lot of people finding them through the source.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Unsigned Hype is arguably the most influential magazine column in the history of music, for the impact that it's had, and that's one of the reasons it's the subject of one of the podcasts that Breakbeat is producing right now. We're doing an 8-part series, called "It Was All a Dream." The inside story of Unsigned Hype. So we're going to tell the whole backstory of how we created that column, all the people that worked at the source, the Matty C's and the Riggs Morales, and all the other people that contributed to that column, and the artists that they discovered. So we it started because people just started mailing us in demo tapes, and we had this stack box of demo tapes piling up in the office. And I think one day, it was just like, let's go through it and try to pick out the best ones and feature them in the magazine every month. So it started in 1990, just like that. And by 91 we had DMX in there. By 92, Biggie, Common, Mobb Deep, Capone and Noriega, David Banner, Joel Santana, uh, Eminem, Jay Electronica, all of these artists. And we had an enormous impact. Many of those artists, we basically got them signed. I mean, the Biggie story, Mr. C came up and played Maddie the demo, and Maddie loved it, and Maddie wanted to put it in the magazine, and Unsigned Hype, and he played it for everyone else in the office, and people gave it the thumbs up. A few weeks later, I get this phone call from Puff, and Puff's like, "Hey, they're giving me a label situation over here." He was, A&R at Uptown at the time, and they're giving me this imprint for my new label, and I'm looking for rappers. And immediately I ran down the hallway to Matty C's office and said, who do we got? What should we send him? And he was like, man, this Biggie Smalls is crazy. And so Matt sent the demo to Puff, and I mean, it was no more than a month or two. Big gets signed. So that's an incredible story and just example of the influence of that column. But it applies to a lot of other artists as well. So I'm excited about that podcast. That'll be dropping at the top of the new year. We'll have a trailer out later in the year for everybody to hear, and I'm excited to tell that story.